In a world where gangsters became politicians and politicians became gangsters, one man walked between both worlds, protecting power while wielding it, serving authority while becoming it. They call him Putin's shadow. But shadows can be darker than what casts them. Viktor Vasilyevich Zolotov was born in 1954 in Leningrad, in the heart of the Soviet security apparatus that defined the city as much as its cultural heritage or architectural grandeur. This wasn't the criminal underworld that produced gangsters. This was the official world of state power, of KGB oversight, of men who served the Communist Party and enforced its will. But in Soviet Russia, the lines between official security services and criminal networks were often blurred, with intelligence officers and gangsters sometimes working the same territories, sometimes cooperating, sometimes indistinguishable. Young Viktor was drawn to physical strength and martial arts, particularly judo and sambo. The Soviet martial art developed for military and police use. He was naturally athletic, disciplined, someone who thrived in structured environments where hierarchy was clear and orders were obeyed without question. This made him perfect for Soviet security services, where physical capability combined with absolute loyalty to authority created ideal operatives. He joined the KGB's 9th Directorate, the elite protection service responsible for guarding Soviet leadership. This wasn't typical KGB work involving intelligence gathering or foreign operations. It was personal security, requiring physical skills, tactical thinking, and absolute discretion. Officers in the 9th Directorate saw things that others didn't, knew secrets that couldn't be shared, operated in proximity to power that few experienced. It was training in how power actually worked, how decisions were really made, how the Soviet elite actually lived behind the propaganda facade. During this period, Viktor developed skills and connections that would define his career. Combat training that made him formidable in physical confrontations, tactical thinking that allowed him to anticipate threats and plan responses, and most importantly, understanding of how power operated in Soviet and later Russian society. He learned that loyalty to powerful individuals mattered more than institutional loyalty, that personal relationships trumped official hierarchies, that protecting the right person could elevate you far beyond what merit alone could achieve. In the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and Leningrad became St. Petersburg, Viktor Zolotov was assigned to protect Anatoly Sobchak, the city's first democratically elected mayor. This assignment changed Viktor's life trajectory completely, because working in Sobchak's administration was a young official named Vladimir Putin, and Viktor would become Putin's personal bodyguard, a relationship that would last decades and make Viktor one of Russia's most powerful and controversial figures. The relationship between bodyguard and protectee is unique and intimate. Bodyguards are present during meetings that others never see, hear conversations that aren't recorded, witness moments of vulnerability that powerful people show to almost no one. Viktor was with Putin constantly, protecting him physically but also observing him, learning how he thought, understanding his priorities, becoming someone Putin could trust absolutely because Viktor had proven his loyalty through years of service. St. Petersburg in the 1990s was violent chaos, with criminal organizations fighting for control, contract killings routine, and officials operating in environments where physical threats were constant. Viktor's job wasn't ceremonial. It was genuinely dangerous, requiring constant vigilance, tactical planning, and willingness to use violence when necessary. He wasn't just standing nearby looking intimidating. He was actively protecting Putin from real threats in a city where being a government official meant being a potential target. But Viktor also witnessed something else during this period: the complex relationships between St. Petersburg officials and criminal organizations, particularly the Tambovskaya Bratva. Whether Putin and his colleagues were cooperating with criminals, tolerating them, or being extorted by them has been endlessly debated. Viktor was present for interactions that others only speculate about, saw relationships that weren't publicly acknowledged, understood connections that official histories deny. This knowledge made him valuable and dangerous in ways that mere physical protection skills never could. When Vladimir Putin moved to Moscow in 1996 to join the federal government, Viktor Zolotov followed, continuing as Putin's bodyguard and becoming part of the inner circle that would eventually control Russia. As Putin rose through government positions, FSB director, prime minister, president, Viktor was always nearby, protecting him physically while also serving as trusted confidant, someone whose loyalty was absolute, whose discretion was guaranteed, whose understanding of Putin's needs and preferences came from years of proximity. Viktor's role evolved beyond mere bodyguarding. He became a fixer, someone who could handle problems that required discretion and force, who could operate in gray zones between legal and illegal, who could protect Putin not just from physical threats but from political and legal ones. He was the person Putin could send when situations required someone absolutely loyal, absolutely capable, absolutely willing to do whatever necessary without asking questions or revealing what had been done. This period saw Viktor accumulating power and connections that transcended his official positions. He built relationships with security services, with business leaders, with political figures throughout Russia. He wasn't elected, wasn't famous, didn't give interviews or make public speeches, but he was known to everyone who mattered as Putin's man, someone whose favor was valuable, whose enmity was dangerous, whose requests carried the weight of the president behind them. The exact nature of Viktor's activities during this period remains murky, by design. People like Viktor operate in shadows, handle matters that don't appear in official records, solve problems using methods that can't be publicly acknowledged. But patterns suggest involvement in everything from protecting business interests of Putin's associates to dealing with political opponents to managing security during sensitive operations. He was the enforcer, the problem solver, the man who did what needed doing without leaving traces. One of the most controversial aspects of Viktor Zolotov's career involves alleged connections to Russian organized crime. These allegations, difficult to prove but persistent from multiple sources, suggest that Viktor maintained relationships with criminal organizations, that he served as a bridge between state power and underworld power, that he facilitated cooperation between criminals and officials when such cooperation served Putin's interests. The logic of such connections is straightforward. Putin's rise to power occurred during a period when Russian organized crime was extraordinarily powerful, when criminal organizations controlled substantial portions of Russia's economy, when cooperation between officials and criminals was common. For Putin to consolidate power required either confronting these organizations, difficult and dangerous, or accommodating them, using them, eventually subordinating them to state authority. Viktor, as Putin's trusted enforcer, would have been central to managing these relationships. Specific allegations include connections to the Tambovskaya Bratva during the St. Petersburg years, relationships with Moscow criminal organizations as Putin consolidated federal power, and ongoing contacts with organized crime figures who were useful to the regime. Former Russian intelligence officers and investigative journalists have claimed that Viktor served as intermediary when Putin needed criminal organizations to handle problems, eliminating political opponents, intimidating business rivals, conducting operations that the state couldn't officially acknowledge. Viktor has denied these allegations, portraying himself as a loyal security officer serving his country and his president. But denials are expected. No one in his position would admit to criminal connections even if they existed. The question isn't whether Viktor denies such connections but whether the pattern of allegations from independent sources, combined with the logic of how power operates in Russia, makes the connections plausible regardless of what he says. In 2004, Viktor Zolotov became head of security for Rosneft, Russia's state oil company and one of the world's largest petroleum producers. This position, ostensibly about protecting corporate assets and executives, was actually far more significant, involving control over security for energy infrastructure worth hundreds of billions, relationships with oligarchs and politicians throughout Russia, and oversight of operations that blurred lines between corporate security and state intelligence. Rosneft's security apparatus under Viktor was massive and sophisticated, employing thousands, using advanced technology, and operating with resources that rivaled some countries' intelligence services. But it was also controversial. Critics allege that Rosneft's security under Viktor conducted operations beyond legitimate corporate protection, that it gathered intelligence on political opponents, that it intimidated business rivals, that it served Putin's political interests as much as Rosneft's corporate ones. The position also made Viktor extraordinarily wealthy. As head of Rosneft Security, he commanded a salary and benefits far exceeding typical government service, accumulated assets that investigative journalists estimated in the hundreds of millions, and had access to resources that made him one of Russia's richest security officials. Whether this wealth came purely from legitimate compensation or also from corrupt arrangements, kickbacks, and illicit dealings has been alleged but not definitively proven. His time at Rosneft also deepened his connections to Russia's oligarch class and business elite. He worked closely with Igor Sechin, Rosneft's CEO and one of Putin's most powerful allies, building relationships that would be valuable when Viktor returned to government service. He understood how Russia's energy industry operated, how deals were made, where money flowed. This knowledge made him valuable to Putin not just as a bodyguard or enforcer but as someone who understood the mechanics of Russia's resource-based economy. In 2016, Vladimir Putin created a new organization, the National Guard of Russia, Rosgvardia, and appointed Viktor Zolotov as its commander. This wasn't typical military restructuring. It was creating a force that reported directly to Putin, bypassed normal command structures, and gave Viktor command over hundreds of thousands of troops, special forces, and internal security assets. It was, in effect, Putin's personal army, and Viktor was its general. Rosgvardia's official mission was domestic security, combating terrorism, controlling crowds, supporting police operations. But its actual role was political, suppressing dissent, intimidating opposition, ensuring that no internal challenges to Putin's rule could succeed through force. With Rosgvardia, Putin had military force answerable only to him, commanded by his most loyal lieutenant, available to be deployed against any domestic threat without requiring approval from defense ministry or other institutions that might have different loyalties. Viktor commanded this force with the same absolute loyalty to Putin that had characterized his entire career. When protests erupted, Rosgvardia was deployed to suppress them. When opposition figures needed intimidation, Rosgvardia resources were available. When Putin needed overwhelming force to demonstrate state power, Viktor provided it. The National Guard became the ultimate tool for maintaining Putin's authoritarian control, and Viktor was the hand wielding that tool. The creation of Rosgvardia under Viktor's command represented something significant about Putin's Russia: the transformation of personal loyalty into institutional power, the elevation of a bodyguard into commander of hundreds of thousands, the formalization of what had always been true, that Viktor was Putin's enforcer, now with official authority and military resources to match his informal power. He had gone from protecting one man to commanding an army that existed to protect that man's regime. In 2018, opposition politician Alexei Navalny released an investigation alleging that Viktor Zolotov had accumulated enormous wealth through corruption, that his lifestyle and assets were inconsistent with his official salary, that he'd used his positions to enrich himself and his family. The investigation was detailed, well-documented, and damaging. It portrayed Viktor not as loyal public servant but as corrupt official who'd used proximity to Putin to build personal fortune. Viktor's response was extraordinary and revealing. He challenged Navalny to a duel, releasing a video where he threatened to turn Navalny into a nice juicy beefsteak. The challenge was crude, violent, completely inappropriate for someone in Viktor's official position, and it was entirely consistent with who he was. Not a refined politician or diplomatic official, but a tough guy, someone whose instinct when challenged was violence, whose response to criticism was threats. The incident revealed what many had suspected. Beneath the official titles and government positions, Viktor remained fundamentally a bodyguard, an enforcer, someone who solved problems through intimidation and force rather than legal or political processes. The mask of respectability had slipped, exposing the reality that Russia's National Guard was commanded by someone whose first instinct when facing criticism was to threaten physical violence. But the incident also demonstrated Viktor's untouchability. In any normal country, a military commander threatening a politician with violence would face consequences: dismissal, prosecution, disgrace. In Putin's Russia, nothing happened to Viktor. The challenge was covered in media, became briefly notorious, then faded with Viktor remaining in his position, his power unchanged, his threat against Navalny having no consequences for him whatsoever. It was a demonstration that in Putin's system, loyalty trumps propriety, that those close to Putin operate by different rules, that Viktor could behave in ways that would destroy others and face no repercussions. Investigative journalists and opposition researchers have spent years attempting to document Viktor Zolotov's wealth, producing estimates ranging from hundreds of millions to billions of dollars. These estimates are based on identified assets, properties, businesses, accounts that Viktor and his family control directly or through intermediaries. But the true extent of his wealth is probably unknowable without access to records that are deliberately hidden or don't officially exist. What can be documented suggests extraordinary accumulation inconsistent with official salaries. Properties worth tens of millions, businesses generating substantial income, assets distributed among family members and associates in patterns consistent with hiding beneficial ownership. The question isn't whether Viktor is wealthy. That's obvious. The question is how wealthy and how that wealth was accumulated. Several sources of potential wealth seem likely. First, legitimate compensation from his various positions. While government salaries are modest, positions like Rosneft's security chief came with substantial pay. Second, gifts and benefits from grateful associates and subordinates. Common in Russian official culture, blurring lines between generosity and corruption. Third, kickbacks and corrupt arrangements involving contracts, positions, and services where Viktor's influence could be monetized. Fourth, business interests where Viktor's connections provided advantages that generated profits. But documenting corruption is difficult when the person involved controls security services, when investigations can be blocked, when witnesses are intimidated, when records can be hidden or destroyed. Viktor operates in an environment where accountability mechanisms that might work elsewhere simply don't function. He's protected by Putin's patronage, by his own control over security resources, by a system where corruption is normalized and challenging powerful officials is dangerous. When Russia intervened in Syria's civil war in 2015, Viktor Zolotov's Rosgvardia was deployed alongside regular military forces, providing security, conducting special operations, and supporting Russian military objectives. This deployment was controversial. Rosgvardia was ostensibly a domestic security force, yet here it was operating in foreign war zone, conducting missions that seemed more appropriate for regular military or special operations forces. The Syrian deployment served multiple purposes. Operationally, Rosgvardia forces provided security and conducted missions that regular military couldn't or wouldn't. Politically, it demonstrated that Viktor's forces were capable of foreign operations, that Rosgvardia was more than just internal security, that Viktor commanded assets that could be deployed wherever Putin needed them. And personally, it gave Viktor military credentials, combat experience, justification for resources and expansion that purely domestic operations might not provide. But the deployment also revealed the nature of Viktor's organization and his relationship with Putin. Rosgvardia wasn't a normal military or security force. It was Putin's personal instrument, deployable anywhere for any purpose, answerable only to Putin through Viktor. The Syrian operations demonstrated that this instrument could be used for foreign military adventures as easily as domestic repression, that Viktor's forces were multipurpose tools of presidential power unconstrained by normal institutional limitations. Reports from Syria suggested that Rosgvardia forces were involved in protecting Russian economic interests, oil facilities, resource extraction, contracts that Russian companies were securing as payment for military support. If true, this would be consistent with Viktor's pattern throughout his career. Blurring lines between official duties and protecting economic interests, between state operations and enrichment of specific individuals, between public service and private benefit. Viktor Zolotov has been sanctioned by the United States, European Union, and other Western countries, targeted for his role in suppressing dissent, for his position in Putin's regime, and for alleged human rights abuses. These sanctions restrict his ability to travel, freeze assets held in jurisdictions enforcing them, and are intended to punish him personally while signaling Western opposition to Putin's authoritarian governance. But sanctions' effectiveness against someone like Viktor is limited. He doesn't travel to Western countries where sanctions would be enforced. His world is Russia and countries friendly to Putin's regime. His wealth is primarily in Russia or jurisdictions that don't enforce Western sanctions. And his power comes from Putin's patronage rather than international acceptance. So being isolated from the West doesn't diminish his position within Russia's system. The sanctions are more symbolic than practical. They identify Viktor as someone Western democracies view as part of an authoritarian regime, as someone whose actions are condemned, as someone who would face consequences if he entered jurisdictions where rule of law applies. But symbols matter less to someone like Viktor than power realities, and the reality is that within Russia, he remains one of the most powerful officials, commanding hundreds of thousands, controlling vast resources, operating with impunity that sanctions from foreign countries don't change. What sanctions do accomplish is ensuring Viktor's fate is tied to Putin's regime. He can't develop Western options, can't build escape routes through European businesses or accounts, can't create alternative futures that don't depend on Putin remaining in power. This locks him into loyalty. not just because of personal devotion but because his interests and Putin's are now inseparably aligned. He succeeds if Putin's regime succeeds, and falls if it falls. Throughout Putin's third and fourth presidential terms, as opposition to his rule has grown, Viktor Zolotov's Rosgvardia has been at the forefront of suppressing dissent. When protests erupt, Rosgvardia forces are deployed to disperse them, arrest participants, and intimidate potential demonstrators. When opposition figures organize resistance, Rosgvardia surveillance and enforcement operations target them. The organization has become synonymous with authoritarian repression, and Viktor commands it without apparent hesitation or moral concern. The tactics used are often brutal: mass arrests of peaceful protesters, excessive force against demonstrators, detention of journalists covering protests, intimidation of anyone showing dissent. Human rights organizations have documented numerous abuses. Testimony from victims describes violence and mistreatment. Videos show Rosgvardia forces beating protesters and journalists. Viktor, as commander, bears ultimate responsibility for these actions, whether he personally orders them or simply creates an environment where subordinates understand that brutality is acceptable. But from Viktor's perspective, this is simply fulfilling his role: protecting Putin's regime, maintaining order, ensuring that opposition doesn't grow into genuine threat to state authority. He's not a Democrat concerned with civil liberties or human rights. He's an enforcer who believes that stability requires force, that dissent must be crushed, that protecting the regime justifies whatever methods are necessary. His background as KGB officer and bodyguard prepared him for exactly this role: absolute loyalty to authority, willingness to use violence, indifference to whether his actions are popular or democratic. The 2021 to 2022 protests over Navalny's imprisonment saw particularly extensive Rosgvardia deployment, with tens of thousands of protesters arrested, hundreds injured, journalists beaten and detained. Viktor's forces operated throughout Russia, ensuring that protests were suppressed quickly, that organizers were arrested, that the message was clear: opposition would not be tolerated, dissent would be crushed, and no amount of public discontent would change the regime's policies. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Viktor Zolotov's Rosgvardia was deployed alongside regular military forces, initially assigned to secure occupied territories and establish control over Ukrainian cities that Russian military expected to quickly capture. This deployment revealed both Rosgvardia's capabilities and its limitations. It was effective at suppressing unarmed civilians but struggled in actual combat when facing armed resistance. Early in the invasion, Rosgvardia forces were reportedly assigned to secure Kiev and other major cities, operating on the assumption that Ukrainian military would collapse and that the primary challenge would be controlling civilian populations. But when Ukrainian resistance proved far more effective than Russian planners anticipated, when military operations failed to achieve quick victory, Rosgvardia forces found themselves in situations they weren't prepared for: actual combat rather than policing operations. Reports emerged of Rosgvardia units suffering casualties, being poorly equipped for combat operations, having morale problems as they realized they were facing real military resistance rather than suppressing protests. Some units reportedly refused to advance, complained about inadequate support, or requested to return to Russia. The organization that was formidable against protesters was less impressive against armed military forces, revealing that Viktor commanded what was essentially a police force with military pretensions rather than actual combat-capable army. Viktor himself became subject to criticism within Russian military circles, with some reportedly blaming Rosgvardia's poor performance for failures in the early invasion phases, questioning why resources had been devoted to building Viktor's organization when regular military needed those resources more. But criticism of Viktor is dangerous in Putin's Russia, and public discussion of Rosgvardia's failures was limited, with state media instead portraying the organization's role as successful support for military operations. Viktor Zolotov's entire career has been built on loyalty to Vladimir Putin, protecting him, serving him, advancing his interests. This absolute loyalty has been rewarded with power, wealth, and impunity that few others enjoy. But it also creates a fundamental vulnerability. Viktor's position depends entirely on Putin remaining in power. When Putin eventually leaves office, through death, retirement, or removal, Viktor's future becomes uncertain and probably dark. Without Putin's protection, Viktor faces potential consequences for decades of controversial actions. Rivals within Russian power structures, opposition figures, international authorities. All might seek accountability for things Viktor did while protected by Putin's patronage. The wealth he accumulated could be seized, the positions he holds could be stripped, the immunity he enjoyed could evaporate. Everything depends on who succeeds Putin and whether that successor values Viktor's loyalty or views him as a liability. Viktor presumably understands this vulnerability and has planned accordingly. Accumulating wealth that could sustain him if he loses official positions, building relationships beyond Putin that might provide protection, perhaps preparing escape routes if Russia becomes unsafe. But no amount of preparation can fully protect someone whose entire career was built on serving one person, whose power came entirely from that person's patronage, whose actions while in power created numerous enemies seeking revenge. The most likely scenarios are either that Viktor manages to become valuable to Putin's successor, transferring his loyalty and receiving continued protection, or that he becomes a scapegoat, blamed for regime actions that the new leadership wants to distance itself from, potentially prosecuted or forced into exile. The least likely scenario is that he continues wielding the same power he currently enjoys, that requires Putin remaining in office indefinitely, which age and mortality make impossible. How should Viktor Zolotov be understood? As loyal public servant who protected his president and maintained order, or as corrupt enforcer who enabled authoritarianism and enriched himself through abuse of power? The answer depends largely on whether you view Putin's regime as legitimate government or authoritarian system, whether you consider stability achieved through repression as valuable or condemnable. From the regime's perspective, Viktor is exemplary. Absolutely loyal, brutally effective, willing to do whatever necessary to protect Putin and maintain control. He's the ideal subordinate in an authoritarian system, someone who understands that power requires force, that opposition must be crushed, that personal morality matters less than regime survival. He built Rosgvardia into an effective instrument of control, suppressed protests that could have threatened stability, and remained loyal when others might have betrayed or challenged Putin. From opposition and Western perspectives, Viktor is exactly what's wrong with Putin's Russia. Corrupt official enriched through abuse of position, brutal enforcer willing to suppress peaceful dissent, someone whose alleged connections to criminal organizations blur lines between state and underworld. He represents the transformation of security services into personal instruments of presidential power, the elevation of loyalty over competence or legality, the creation of parallel military forces answerable only to one man. The truth probably includes elements of both perspectives. Viktor is genuinely loyal to Putin. That loyalty isn't faked or purely transactional. But that loyalty has been immensely profitable for him, has allowed him to accumulate wealth and power far beyond what his official positions would normally provide. He's both servant and beneficiary of Putin's system, both enforcer of authoritarianism and criminal profiting from it. Viktor Zolotov represents the ultimate evolution of Putin's security state, the transformation of personal bodyguard into commander of hundreds of thousands, the elevation of absolute loyalty into institutional power, the creation of military force that exists solely to protect one man's rule. He's proof that in Putin's Russia, proximity to power matters more than merit, that loyalty trumps competence, that those willing to do anything for the regime can achieve positions that democratic systems would never grant them. His story is one of absolute loyalty rewarded with absolute power, and the absolute corruption that such arrangements inevitably produce. He protected Putin physically for decades, understood Putin's needs and priorities better than almost anyone, proved through years of service that he could be trusted completely. That trust was rewarded with command of National Guard, with wealth estimated in hundreds of millions or billions, with impunity from consequences that would destroy others. But his story is also about the dangers of such systems, that creating personal armies commanded by absolutely loyal enforcers is how authoritarian regimes maintain power but also how they eventually fail, that elevating bodyguards to command hundreds of thousands ensures loyalty but sacrifices competence, that building systems based on personal relationships rather than institutional structures creates vulnerabilities that eventually become fatal. Viktor sits atop the Russian security apparatus, commanding Rosgvardia, wielding enormous power, operating with impunity. But his position is fundamentally precarious because it depends entirely on Putin. He's built nothing that would survive Putin's departure, created no legacy beyond serving one man, accumulated power that is borrowed rather than owned. He's the shadow that becomes visible, the enforcer elevated to official authority, the bodyguard who became a general. and all of it disappears the moment the man he's protecting is gone. Viktor Zolotov proved that in Putin's Russia, the ultimate reward for absolute loyalty is absolute power, and the ultimate vulnerability is that everything depends on one man remaining in charge forever. He started as a bodyguard, protecting Putin when Putin was just an official in St. Petersburg's chaotic administration, standing nearby while his boss navigated between government authority and criminal power, learning that survival required understanding both worlds and moving between them without hesitation. For 30 years, he's been Putin's shadow, the enforcer who handles problems that require force rather than finesse, the fixer who operates in gray zones between legal and criminal, the loyal servant elevated far beyond what merit alone could achieve. They gave him command of Rosnefte's security, controlling billions in energy assets while allegedly accumulating hundreds of millions in personal wealth. They made him director of National Guard, commanding hundreds of thousands of troops and special forces that answer only to Putin, that exist to suppress dissent and protect the regime from internal threats. He's beaten protesters, intimidated opponents, threatened politicians with violence, deployed his forces to war zones, all while accumulating wealth that his official salaries couldn't possibly explain, all while maintaining alleged connections to the same criminal underworld that Putin supposedly opposes. He's untouchable because Putin protects him, powerful because Putin empowers him, wealthy because Putin allows it. But he's also trapped. His fate is tied to Putin's regime so completely that when Putin falls, Viktor falls with him. When the regime changes, Viktor becomes the scapegoat. When protection disappears, accountability arrives. He built nothing that survives without Putin, created no institution that transcends personal loyalty, accumulated power that evaporates the moment his patron is gone. Viktor Zolotov, the bodyguard who became a general, the enforcer who commands an army, the shadow who became untouchable but remains fundamentally temporary, powerful only as long as the man he serves remains more powerful, safe only as long as Putin lives and rules, a reminder that in authoritarian systems, absolute loyalty brings absolute power and absolute vulnerability simultaneously.